Two Scottish brothers, Alexander and John Ruthven, had a plan. They would either kidnap or kill the king, James VI, whichever came easiest. The Ruthven family had a grudge against James, who had their father executed years ago because he was himself involved in another plot to kidnap the king and separate him from his pro-French favorite. But we'll discuss that soon enough. In August of 1600, King James and a small retinue came to their estate, Gowrie House, in the city of Perth. While John would entertain the king's courtiers and bodyguard, Alexander would get the king to sneak away with him into a private chamber. The exact details are murky, but it does seem like Alexander was successful in coaxing the king to slip away from his own guards. A fight broke out, in which the king was nearly killed, but James's men were able to rescue him and fight the Ruthven brothers, who were both killed in the following struggle. Rather than sympathizing with her husband after his near-death experience, James's queen, Anne of Denmark, instead scolded him when she saw him and refused to leave her private apartments. Since she was then pregnant with the future King Charles, she also threatened to stay separated from James after the child was born. Now maybe the reason Queen Anne was furious was because she was friends with the Ruthven's sister, who was her lady-in-waiting, and she believed the rumor that there was no plot after all, just that a brawl broke out between the king and Alexander Ruthven. And the official story about what would become the Gowrie plot was that Alexander had told the king that someone had discovered a pot of gold coins on his lands, and he wanted James to see them for himself. That was the account that preachers across Scotland were ordered to give, since churches at the time were both social centers and news hubs. The thing was, many people didn't believe it. The story that James was tricked with a fictional pot of gold was spread among diplomatic circles in England and France, but the Scottish diplomats had to drop it because people just kept joking about it. A contemporary, the English writer Francis Osborne, wrote, "No Scottish man you met did anything but laugh about it." That's because, both in and outside Scotland, people fought James, the king who would later become famous for uniting the crowns of Scotland and England, and who commissioned a translation of the Bible that some socially reactionary Protestant Christians still say to this day is the only valid English translation of Scripture. That king was actually lured away from his guards for sex with a strapping young man. This is Pre-Stonewall.
Down beneath the deep blue sea, where one day I chanced to be, the mermaids gave a very swell affair. I looked out from my submarine at the queerest ball I'd ever seen. Not a soul on earth I knew was there. Of course they did the tango, and no one made a slip. Of all the guests assembled there, each one could do the dip. At the mermaid's fancy ball in Father Neptune's hall, the little eels were pickled and they did a naughty wiggle. Although it shocked a few old crabs, it made the bluefish giggle. At the mermaid's fancy ball, they had no bar at all. But I didn't hear a sigh, for not a guest was dry at the mermaid's fancy ball.
If any monarch of the time could be described as a poor little rich boy, it was King James. His mother was the tragic, ill-fated Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart, as the betrothed to the heir to the French throne. She was more French than Scottish, and as she remained a staunch Catholic, made things shaky when she returned to Scotland to reign as queen in person. She did enact a policy of religious tolerance, not that she had much choice. Meanwhile, James's father was Mary's distant cousin, Henry Stuart, but while he was handsome and athletic, he was also something of a Renaissance-era frat boy with everything that entails. Their marriage was dysfunctional even by the standards of politically motivated royal marriages, and when Henry was murdered, specifically smothered to death after escaping from his house, which had been blown up with gunpowder, Mary became the prime suspect of being the mastermind behind the elaborate assassination. She was forced to abdicate her throne and fled to England, leaving the practically orphaned James to become king when he was only 13 months old. James's childhood was what you might expect from a child entrusted to the care of a bunch of 16th century Calvinists, basically meaning his childhood was a long series of beatings. But while his tutor, George Buchanan, was strict, he was also an accomplished scholar and poet in his own right. And if James wasn't a king, he might have been a scholar. As an adult, he was even an essayist, writing about politics, the law, demons, witches, and even the dangers of smoking. In case you're wondering, yes, he was aware that smoking is bad for the lungs. Besides being genuinely intelligent, James was also praised for being unusually chaste for a young man of his rank, never pursuing women. You can see where this is going. While the crotchety Calvinists around James were pleased that he was apparently chaste, their relief turned to horror when he started showing interest in a cousin from France, Esme Stewart. James would embrace and kiss Esme in public. While kisses shared between men was not unusual at the time, his public affections were frequent and unseemly enough that there were concerns among the clergy that Esme was leading James into carnal lust. But not only was Esme possibly the king's male lover, he was pro-French, pro-Spanish, and anti-English. Even after Esme Stewart converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, his days in Scotland were numbered. With the tacit support of the English ambassador to Scotland, a conspiracy was formed. One of the ringleaders was the very head of the Ruthven clan, whom James would later have killed, fueling that Ruthven vendetta against him. In 1582, James was kidnapped and forced to sign a decree of banishment against Esme Stewart. He returned to France, where he kept writing to James and died a year later. James wrote a poem commemorating him, the metaphorical invention of a tragedy called Phoenix. In it, the narrator describes coming across a beautiful phoenix who flew all the way to Scotland from Arabia. The poem speaker is instantly entranced by the phoenix's beauty, which outshines the sun itself, and the bird consents to become the narrator's constant companion. Unfortunately, this only inspired malicious jealousy from the people around the narrator. He tries to protect the phoenix from their vicious attacks, and one line even reads, "Till she betwixt my legs herself did cast." The narrator is powerless to help the phoenix against its attackers, who are willing to even stab the narrator in his legs to get at the phoenix, and the bird flies away for good, back to its homeland. It is true that throughout the poem the phoenix is identified as a she. However, just in case anyone might say the poem was just James dabbling in some creative writing, the first and last letters of the line spell out Esme Stewart's name. When Esme died, he had his heart embalmed and shipped to James. And throughout his life, James acted as a father figure to Esme's son, Ludovic. By 1603, James was offered the crown of England. His Catholic mother Mary had been a top contender to succeed the childless Queen Elizabeth I, since she was the Queen's first cousin. But her Catholicism and the fact that she was caught conspiring against Queen Elizabeth eventually got her imprisoned and then executed. As a good male Protestant with 3 future heirs by his wife, James was a much more appealing candidate to the English, even if he was a foreigner. Perhaps as a sign of how being the King of Scotland and incidents like the Esme Stewart affair affected him, After James and his family made their triumphant march into London, he would only return to Scotland once before his death. As King of England, James seemed genuinely committed to his predecessor Elizabeth's policy of not interfering with their subjects' religious conscience, so long as they outwardly showed obedience to the official church, and he brought peace to England after over a decade of war with Spain. But he was also a sanctimonious know-it-all, literally seeing himself as the schoolmaster of both his kingdoms, and prone to lecture everyone from his wife to his subjects, while at the same time he was a notorious drunk who presided over a royal court that scandalized the public, where the men were greedy brown-nosers, and the women wore dresses that practically exposed their breasts. James also became as known for his male lovers in England as he was in Scotland. Curiously, though, people seemed more upset by the king paying off the debts of men from Scotland no less, than the fact that he was having sex with them. One member of the English Parliament complained what was the point of collecting taxes for the royal treasury at all, if it shall daily run out thence by private cocks. And yes, cock was a double entendre then, as it is now. Francis Osborne complained, for the king kissing them after so lascivious a mode in public, and upon the theatre, as it were, of the world, prompted many to imagine some things done in the tiring house that exceed my expressions. By 1607, James had a clear new favorite, a Scotsman named Robert Carr, who also, not coincidentally, had the distinction of being the first Scotsman to have a seat in the English Parliament. James reportedly fell in love with him after he helped him when he saw Robert fall from a horse. When Robert Carr started fighting with the men who would become James's next favorite, George Villiers, the future Duke of Buckingham, James wrote a furious letter castigating him for his petty acts of jealousy and spite. Luckily, the letter survives in its entirety, and it contains a very explicit sentence. It reads, "I leave out of this reckoning your long creeping back and withdrawing yourself from lying in my chamber, notwithstanding my many hundred times earnestly soliciting you to the contrary." Even a historian who wants to argue that James was just friends with his favorites would struggle to get around such a blunt sentence, unless they want to argue that Robert Carr just kept coming to James's bedroom to play chess. The seedy reputation of James's court came to a head with a good old-fashioned scandal, although it wasn't a scandal that was caused by his very open affection for Robert Carr. Instead, the actual political crisis started when Robert wanted to marry a wealthy English heiress, Frances Howard, who seems to have lusted after Robert on her part. The problem was that she was already married to the Earl of Essex. King James made sure that the marriage was annulled on the somewhat dubious grounds that the Earl was impotent. In his defense, the Earl claimed that he was only impotent with her, complaining that she constantly reviled him and miscalled him, terming him a cow and coward and beast. Thomas Overbury, a courtier who was against the marriage for political reasons, was discreetly offered a position as ambassador to Russia. When he refused that, he was imprisoned at the king's order, and later found dead of poison. Although Robert and Frances were free to marry, even the king couldn't protect them for long once the allegations of poison seeped out. Both were brought to trial and found guilty of murder. James saved them from the executioner's block and commuted their sentences, but after they served their time, they could not return to court, and instead retired to the countryside to live out their days in obscurity. In any case, by this time, James's affections were turning toward another man, the aforementioned George Villiers. We'll return to that story, along with my thoughts on how a king who, in very clear terms, condemned the sin of sodomy in his writings, was himself a man who had sex with other men. For now, though, let me close with one of the letters James wrote to Robert Carr, a letter that comes across as the frustrated outpouring of a lover, who has been hurt by his beloved. But for the easing of my inward and consuming grief, all I crave is that in all the words and actions of your life, ye may ever make it appear to me that ye never think to hold grip of me, but out of my mere love, and not one hair by fear. Consider that I am a free man, if I were not a king. Remember that all your being, except your breathing and soul, is from me. I told you twice or thrice that ye might lead me by the heart, and not by the nose. I cannot deal honestly, if I deal not plainly with you. If ever I find that ye think to retain me by one sparkle of fear, all the violence of my love will in that instant be changed into as violent a hatred. God is my judge, my love hath been infinite towards you, and the only strength of my affection towards you hath made me bear with these things in you and bridle my passions to the utmost of my ability. Let me be met then with your entire heart, but softened with humility. Let me never apprehend that ye disdain my person and undervalue my qualities, nor let it not appear that any part of your former affection is cooled towards me.